All right. Thanks for joining me. We're here with R Shmuli Phillips, who wrote a recent best-selling book called Judaism Reclaimed, Philosophy and Theology in the Torah. We're honored to be with you. Thank you so much for joining me. It's good evening to you, I guess, right now.
Good evening, good night. Yes, the honor is mine. Thank you very much for having me on your group, on your podcast.
Okay. So, first of all, tell us a little bit about you and what got you to write this book, and then we'll go into what the book is all about.
Okay, so it's quite an unusual book in many respects. What it seeks to do is to really enrich the discourse of serious discussion and debate in Jewish thought across the Jewish world. I find that very often there are important perspectives, approaches, techniques to addressing the challenges which tend not to be heard in mainstream Jewish discussion. These ideas and principles are advanced by people like the Rambam and Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. They both tend to be ignored very often in contemporary Jewish discourse. So very often they stand out, Rambam and Rav Hirsch in their different eras, they stand out in the way in which they embraced the challenges of science, philosophy, the disciplines often referred to as worldly knowledge, the challenges that these were understood to represent to the traditional Jewish beliefs. And rather than hide away and wall themselves off from these questions, these disciplines, they sought to reconcile them with Torah teachings without reducing the significance of either. They didn't hide away from the knowledge of their own eras. They tried to look at how the Torah could be understood without reducing the Torah, without reducing the science, and how to work with them together. These rabbinic thinkers grappled openly with the challenges faced by traditional Judaism in their respective eras. And I find the value lies not just in citing their words and quoting long passages, but rather in analyzing their underlying techniques and applying them to help us grapple with issues facing Judaism today.
Thank you for that. What can your book offer to someone who doesn't know much about Judaism? I like that your layout is kind of user friendly, and you're trying to bring in as many people from as large a varying background as possible. What would you tell someone who doesn't know much about Judaism, doesn't have a good background, but wants to learn more?
So I build up through the chapters, and each one is linked somewhat to each particular parasha, each particular Torah portion, and I'll identify typically an area of Jewish theology, Jewish philosophy, a broader discussion which is linked to that parasha, and a way in which people have struggled with it in certain respects, and I'll show how various thinkers from across the range of rabbinic and academic thinkers have tried to address this topic. So for people who have less of a background in traditional Jewish thought, they'll often be aware of the scientific, the academic challenges, but they won't necessarily be aware of the traditional sources which actually provides interesting, sometimes very reasonable responses to it.
So what are you trying to accomplish overall? Okay, before I get to that, let me just say something that I was thinking that I had in mind. When I first saw your book, before I even, looked at the description, I was thinking about, like, throughout the generations. You mentioned, of course, the Rambam, Maimonides, who wrote the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed, and that was, the one of the most seminal works ever written that kind of set Judaism on its path. Ironically, of course, many Jews at the time rejected it, and even to this day, it is a book that many authorities claim you shouldn't read if you don't have certain background, or it's not for everyone, or you have to know how to study it. But be it as it may, Maimonides and his philosophy very much kind of set Judaism on its path into the modern, up until this, the modern age. of course, before Rambam, you had other Jewish philosophers like Saadia Gaon, and you had rabbinic Judaism, develop as time goes on, the axioms and the things that we understand, Judaism, the anchors of Judaism. My point is that throughout the generations, you always had people who kind of looked around and said, you know what, people are confused, and let me write a book and kind of set people, straight. So there's less confusion and cacophony. Let's set down some kind of like, this is
order and system.
Judaism. Don't get it twisted. This is what Judaism is, and kind of set people's minds at ease. People's minds only have the capacity to host a finite number of ideas before they kind of either, I always use the Tetris kind of thing where, if you don't fit in the blocks, forget it. People's minds tend to go like that. So I think that was the intent of the great Jewish philosophers throughout the ages, kind of set down, basic fundamentals of Judaism so people can feel stable, anchored, moored. Most famously Rambam, as I said, with more Nevuchim, but throughout the generations there were, I don't call it copycats, but like similar undertakings up until recently. And then when the Haskalah movement, for instance, came about, there was a man named Nachman Krochmal who wrote a book called More Nevuchim Hazaman, More Nevuchim for our time, a guy for the place of our time. This was during the Haskalah period in Eastern Europe, in the 1800s. And of course, that was a very, very controversial book. And the Haskalah was a controversial movement. And of course, even though he was from the traditionalist wing of the Haskalah, he didn't reject the Jewish fundamentals, but kind of wanted to kind of meld modern ideas with traditional Jewish values. But that's obviously, I don't want to get too much off on a tangent. So when I saw your book, I was basically thinking he's following in this glorious tradition of people since Maimonides, down to Rabbi Breuer, who also wrote a More Nevuchim for his time, down to all the other greats who tried to kind of like set down. But yours is even more than that. You bring down all kinds of disparate sources from the golden age of Andalusian Sephardic Jewry, philosophers from that orbit, to Hasidic thinkers of recent years, to like the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And I love that. I love the variety because, first of all, you are appealing to large cross-section of Jewry, which is very important. And secondly, I think you have this tapestry, very a talented way of kind of bringing things together and showing that we're all drinking from the same well. So how much do you think your book is a More Nevuchim of our modern 21st century? And do you agree with my characterization that we can put it in that category, or you would think it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that?
Well, it's interesting in terms of trying to categorize it, because I find it very hard to know which pigeonhole to put it in. When I was sending the book out for review for various rabbis, academics, they all said to me, what sort of book is it and what's its intended audience? And I wasn't really sure. And their question to me was, well, who's going to read it? It's, for the academics out there, they're not necessarily looking for this sort of book. For the people who are sitting in yeshivot, they're not necessarily looking for this sort of book. Who else is interested in Jewish philosophy? And what I've really found from the feedback is that everyone has really found some kind of additional sources or inspiration or something in it. So really what I try to do is we talk about More Nevuchim, and very often people get caught up in the very precise Aristotelian formulations of Rambam. As it's always talked about with the relevance of More Nevuchim in our age. One of the things that people criticize or are less comfortable about learning More Nevuchim nowadays is that we don't live in the Aristotelian framework. We don't look at the world with the spheres and the perfect movements of the celestial bodies. And so trying to resolve Judaism with that is, it's of academic interest, but in terms of the mainstream Jewish community, what do we gain from it? So what I really try to do, I'll try and give a couple of examples of this, is I try to identify I try to identify the approaches of Rambam and distill his underlying techniques and ideas, and then apply those to the questions facing Judaism today. For example, we have, Rambam talks about how the Torah addresses the reader in human terms, Dibra Torah Lashon Bnei Adam, and we have to. Rambam is very much, he emphasizes the need to read the Torah in light of who the initial generation who was receiving it was. When he looks at the Tamei mitzvot, when he looks at the way in which the mitzvot are presented, the psukim are structured and addressing us. Here we have to know about the ancient Near Eastern societies, their political, their religious structures, their writings, their legal codes. A proper understanding of the societal and religious backdrop to the Torah's teachings can be crucial to providing context to the Torah's teachings. They help us to highlight its agenda. For example, Rambam will talk about how the presentation of the Torah's blessings and curses deliberately mirror the promises and threats made by pagan priests in the earlier generations. He cites ancient sources to demonstrate how people were promised peace and prosperity, rainfall, crop abundance if they worshipped the pagan temples. And this is why, according to Rambam, the Torah's teachings and its promises of rewards and punishments are deliberately couched in such words and phrases. And Rambam goes as far as to express his sincere regret at one stage in the Moreh Nevuchim. He expresses his regret that he doesn't have more access to such ancient texts, and that his lack of knowledge of the ancient world has necessarily limited his ability to explain some parts of the Torah. So when we look at it today, with the archaeological discoveries that we now have and the new information that we have in our era, that 900 years later or 800 years later, so we can now take that technique that the Rambam has shown us of having to make use of our knowledge of the ancient Near East, and we can update that. We can now look at these, for example, the Code of Hammurabi and the various other codes and writings we have from the ancient Near East, and not see that as a conflict and a challenge to our understanding of the Torah, but use it to enrich our understanding of the Torah. Similarly, when it comes to science, Rambam goes on and on. There are many chapters about how trying to poke holes or show certain weaknesses in Aristotle's theory of Kadmut Ha'olam, that the world had no creator, in effect, that the world is eternal, that God is just a permanent cog in the wheel, an unmoved mover, and that he had no will in the creation of the world. He's not there providentially, there are no miracles. And that was the prevailing wisdom of the time. And Rambam he says that is incompatible with the Torah, and he works very hard to try and push against it. But to a certain extent, he says, well, if it's God creating the world from pre-existing material, as in the way Plato looked at it, maybe there is some room to interpret the Torah that way. And is there sufficient proof for that or not? And he was struggling with that. So again, many of these arguments, many of these theories are not so relevant to us today. But what we can look at, and this is what I do in some of the chapters I look at on the Torah and science, is I say, well, what was the bar of acceptability? What was the necessary proof that Rambam required in order for the Torah to be reinterpreted in a less literal way? And we can now look at the scientific theories of our generation, which appear to challenge the literal meaning of the Torah, and say, well, if Rambam was living in our generation and he was exposed to these scientific theories and proofs, would he feel the need to interpret the Torah in a less literal way? I often don't give conclusions to these questions. I don't possess great scientific knowledge. What I try to do is I identify the Rambam's broader approach, his technique, and I try to show how that can be used in our generation to address the questions we have today.
Yeah, that's so important and such a relevant topic. I mean, since you brought up, potential conflicts between our beliefs and that of science, those of science. I mean, this week's Parsha, I mean, that's kind of ground zero for all of it, right? The age of the universe, the great deluge. How would you reconcile? So let's say, you know, for someone who's secular, traditional, grew up with an appreciation, let's say, belief in science and what science has to say about the age of the universe, and let's say in the great flood and the flood myths, so to speak. How would you tell a person like that, you know what, you can believe in that. There's absolutely no contradiction. And would you, I hope you don't mind me asking you, how does your approach differ, for instance, from that of your landsman Nathan Slifkin?
So in terms of the books which are already out there,
Yeah.
there are many books which go into the details of the science and and look at how the creation story can be reinterpreted, the flood could be reinterpreted. And I'm the first to admit I don't have great scientific knowledge. It's never been something I've really excelled in. So I summarize the approaches of Rabbi Slifkin. I summarize the approaches of, say, Rabbi Meiselman, Robert Jonathan Sachs. I show the various different approaches there are, and I don't give conclusions. I assume that a fair number of the readers of my book possess more scientific knowledge than I do. What I do is I show the different approaches there are, and then I compare the questions which they are facing with the questions which Rambam and others are facing in their generation. And I say, well, this is the level of proof, the level of certainty that Rambam needed in order to, let's say, reinterpret the Torah to meet Plato's understanding of God creating the world from pre-existing matter. And he said, if it reaches level X of certainty, then it's legitimate to reinterpret the Torah that way. And I leave it as an open question, really, as to whether such a level of proof exists in our generation. I show that there definitely exists, and there have been many books and articles written by great scholars about how we can, in theory, reinterpret the Torah in a less literal way, to be teaching us lessons about the divine involvement in the world and our relationship with God, rather than teaching us precise scientific facts and truths. And I really leave it open to the reader. I try to show the techniques. I try to show how the Rambam and others would have approached this matter in our generation. So it differs if people are looking for a detailed scientific analysis of these matters. There are many other books out there. What I try to show is more the philosophy of science that the Rishonim held, and how that would be applied into Jay's generation. I do it in terms of science, a little bit in terms of archaeology, and when I mentioned before Rav Simson Raphael Hirsch, who lived in the post-Enlightenment era in Germany. So he focused more, let's say, the moral issues. He talks a lot about slavery and racism and those sorts of matters, the role of women. So I look at how Rav Hirsch discussed it. Again, 150 years ago in Germany was a different world. But he was already beginning to grapple with these issues. He lived at the time of the start of the biblical criticism era. So I look at how Rav Hirsch approached that matter, and more recent rabbinic authorities. What are their techniques? How do they approach it? And how we may be able to apply their thinking to the questions that we're facing nowadays.
That's very good. What do you think is the biggest challenge facing us today in terms of observance, in terms of keeping our youth engaged and interested?
So that's an interesting question, in terms of the difference between what specifically our generation faces compared to challenges of the previous generation. Because there's always been the Haskalah movement, the philosophers of Spain, the Aristotelians, who Rambam was trying to bring closer. So what is it specifically in our generation which is a challenge? So I find really there are two things. The first is the exposure to a mass of ideas and challenges in the online world. The massive information and challenges which confront people is unique. It's not something which I think previous generations have faced. And don't get me wrong, the online discussions and learning can be a positive thing. People can gain a lot from learning things online. The information which is available to us, even on things like Wikipedia or YouTube, it's massive. But this is only really if people are ready and prepared and well-grounded and comfortable within their own Jewish traditions before being exposed to these challenges. And one of the things which pushed me to write Judaism Reclaimed was the realization of how ill-prepared many Orthodox Jews are. Even those who spent several years studying in yeshivot, they're ill-prepared for the challenges that may confront their religious beliefs. One phenomenon I've noticed, and this is really true in all areas of life nowadays, not specifically a challenge to Judaism, but to any real discipline of learning, all disciplines of serious thought, that it's considerably easier and quicker to challenge and poke holes in a theory, a system of thought, than it is to defend it and uphold it. If I can quote from a rock song that was popular in my younger years, it only takes one tree to make 1,000 matches, only takes one match to burn 1,000 trees. It's very easy to destroy and to poke holes and to criticize something. It's much harder to really put something down on the table and construct a theory. You see it in politics. It's much easier to be the party in opposition than it is to be the one who's actually having to stand up there and do something. It's far easier always to challenge than to construct a solid and logical theory. To pose intelligent questions at any system of belief, any religious system, any political theory of governance, any scientific theory, the defense of which may require a person to possess considerable background knowledge and construct a carefully thought out, nuanced, and sometimes lengthy explanation. And this is something really which we see playing out every day in the media, particularly on social media, when we have scientific theories and conclusions which have been carefully developed, researched, tested, sometimes for many years, which are dismissed and ridiculed out of hand in catchy memes and headlines and tweets. This isn't to say that expert opinions must be accepted blindly and without any critical examination. What I'm trying to point out is that it's an uneven playing field. For all the time and energy that it takes to produce the initial theory and subsequently to launch an adequate defense of it, a single clever, catchy, funny meme or headline can damage this theory irreparably in the unforgiving court of public opinion. And the same problem... There we go. So the idea existed certainly in the time of Chazal, but to me that's really what typifies the challenge of our generation. It increasingly afflicts the traditional believing Jew trying to navigate his or her way through the secular world, the university campus, and especially through social media and the blogosphere. They can easily find themselves peppered with questions and challenges, often from well-lettered academics, based on biblical criticism, morality, archaeology, among other areas.
There's certainly a lot of cynicism in the world. And now with the age of the internet and everything at your fingertips, it's a lot more maybe overwhelming and so easy to access for everyone. And that certainly calls for a response. So I think that's certainly understandable. My question is, do you understand, do you take into account the position of the very insular Haredim? And I say very insular because not all Haredim, ultra-Orthodox Jews, if you will, are of the same, cut of the same bowl, who eschew any kind of, philosophical inquiry or to try to reconcile Torah with any other discipline that they perceive to be any other discipline outside of the realm of Torah. So I'm sure there would be some Hasidic, some ultra Haredi, not just Hasidic, who would say, no, we have the Torah, we need absolutely nothing else to help us understand, help us learn. We need absolutely nothing outside of, and again, this is already a millennia old, this disagreement between the forces of rationalism, the forces of pure belief, Ashkenaz and Sfarad, if you will. But do you understand their perspective and where they're coming from, and do you appreciate it?
So I actually go through this very much in the first chapter of my book, Judaism Reclaimed, for those who haven't seen it.
Yes.
It's on reverse. You don't see it so well.
No, I guess he's
You
perfectly.
see it? So the first chapter of the book, titled "The Legitimacy of Philosophical Investigation." So I go through. I take my my point of departure, a machloket between Rambam and Ravad about the nature of God's knowledge. So it's the century millennial old question of how we can both understand that God has absolute knowledge of everything, future events, and that we have genuine free will. And this is, we have Rabbi Akiva already in the Mishnah saying how there is knowledge, there is free will, and he just leaves it. And we find in Hilchot Shuvah, the Rambam goes through a lengthy exposition, about the question, and talking about that, what does it mean that God has knowledge, and what does it mean we have free will? And he really grapples with it, and he struggles with the question before standing back and saying, well, to a certain extent, we just have to leave this as a matter of belief. We know that God's knowledge is beyond something we can understand, and we just have to accept that God has this knowledge and we have free will. And Ravad really takes him to task. He says, this isn't the way of the sages. This is not the way of Jewish tradition. If there's a difficult question of philosophy, if there's something which we know we cannot give a simple answer to, we have no permission to get involved with it in the first place. And I really I understand that these are the two opinions which really lay the groundwork for the two approaches we find even nowadays. We have those who follow the position of Rambam, who find value in probing the philosophical questions, the theological questions. What do we understand? What do we not understand? How can we improve our understanding? Can we define exactly what it is we can and can't define, can and can't understand? And there's great value in that for the Rambam. And each time you push it a little bit further, you've gained a greater understanding of Judaism, of the Torah, of God. Whereas for Ravad, the whole thing is dangerous. You're exposing people to questions which they may not have simple answers to. It's best to just leave it as a matter of faith, or better still not to discuss it altogether. And I showed these are really, the Ravad's approach really gained a lot of popularity. But once again, we talk about today's generation and the great wall of information with the internet and the media, it becomes increasingly hard to really wall yourself off from the outside world. I suppose in Israel it's a little bit easier among the insular communities, but it's becoming increasingly difficult. I quote from Rav Shimon Schwab, who's a rabbi in America. He said something in the 1960s. He already says that while in previous generations it was a tenable option, if one considered it the right thing to do, it was actually tenable to seal oneself off from the outside world and just surround oneself in learning halakha and basic ideas of Jewish thought. Nowadays, he says in the 1960s, the pre-internet era, he says it's impossible because the forces of Kfirah, the challenges to the Torah, have come right into the Jewish world, in the Jewish bookshops, and the Jewish books, and the Jewish newspapers. And he says that we have to have responses ready for them. We have to be able to discuss these matters openly, teach them to our children, and bring them up openly facing these issues. So I have found, I've been surprised at how widely my book has been read. I know it's been sold in the bookshops in Lakewood, in Gateshead, and I've received feedback from people who've been in Haredi Kolelim for 10, 20 years saying, yeah, I had this question. I didn't realize it was a legitimate question to ask. I just filed it away. I didn't let it bother me. But now your book is there. It's great. I didn't realize that there were chachamim out there who grappled with this. And they're actually very grateful to the fact they have this book, which can help them in this matter. And I deliberately went for a publisher, Mosaic Press, which has at least 1 foot strongly in the Haredi world. They distribute with Feldheim, which gets into the Haredi bookstores. I have approbation, Haskama, as well as from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. I have from Rabbi Zev Leff, who's a Haredi Rosh Yeshiva. So I very much wanted it to be seen as something which could be read and accepted by a wide range of people, which is why often I show techniques, I show ideas and how they can be applied. I don't try and force answers down people's throats. Especially when it comes to things like science and Torah, most people have already made their minds up. You're not going to persuade someone in a little book how to think in these matters, but to show people how Chachamim in previous generations have grappled with these issues. That is something which can really assist them when it comes to working and grappling with the issues they're facing in their Judaism.
Okay, we're out of time now. I want to thank you so much for this. It's been a very enlightening and informative discussion with you. I will post a link to this book, and I urge everyone to check it out. It's R Shmuli Phillips, the author of Judaism Reclaimed, Philosophy and Theology in the Torah. I want to bid you good night, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you for hosting me on your group, on your show.